Okay, so this is the Bible study for 1 Samuel chapter 15, verses 1 through 21. And it says, Samuel said to Saul, I am the one the Lord sent to anoint you king over his people Israel. So listen now to the message from the Lord. This is what the Lord Almighty says. I will punish the Amalekites for what they did to Israel when they waylaid them as they came out of Egypt. Now go, attack the Amalekites and totally destroy all that belongs to them. Do not spare them. Put to death men, women, and children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys. So Saul summoned the men and mustered them at Telaim, 200,000 foot soldiers and 10,000 from Judah. Saul went to the city of Amalek and set an ambush in the ravine. Then he said to the Kenites, Go away, leave the Amalekites so that I do not destroy you along with them. For you showed kindness to all the Israelites when they came up out of Egypt. So the Kenites moved away from the Amalekites. Then Saul attacked the Amalekites all the way from Havilah to Shur, near the eastern border of Egypt. He took Agag, king of the Amalekites, alive, and his people he totally destroyed with the sword. But Saul said to the army, Saul and the army spared Agag and the best of the sheep and cattle, the fat calves and lambs, everything that was good. These they were unwilling to destroy completely, but everything that was despised and weak they totally destroyed. Then the word of the Lord came to Samuel. I regret that I have made Saul king, because he has turned away from me and has not carried out my instructions. Samuel was angry, and he cried out to the Lord all that night. Early in the morning, Samuel got up and went to meet Saul, but he was told, Saul has gone to Carmel. There he has set up a monument in his own honor and has turned and gone down to Gilgal. When Samuel reached him, Saul said, The Lord bless you. I have carried out the Lord's instructions. But Samuel said, What then is the bleating of sheep in my ears? What is this lowing of cattle that I hear? Saul answered, The soldiers brought them from the Amalekites. They spared the best of the sheep and the cattle to sacrifice to the Lord your God, but we totally destroyed the rest. Enough, Samuel said to Saul. Let me tell you what the Lord said to me last night. Tell me, Saul replied. Samuel said, Although you were once small in your own eyes, did you not become the head of the tribes of Israel? The Lord anointed you king over Israel, and he sent you on a mission, saying, Go and completely destroy these wicked people, the Amalekites. Wage war against them until you have wiped them out. Why did you not obey the Lord? Why did you pounce on the plunder and do evil in the eyes of the Lord? But I did obey the Lord, Saul said. I went on the mission the Lord assigned me. I completely destroyed the Amalekites and brought back Agag, their king. The soldiers took sheep and cattle from the plunder, the best of what was devoted to God, in order to sacrifice them to the Lord your God at Gilgal. Okay, so we seem to have an interpretation problem here between Saul and Samuel and God. So remember that you can download PDF copies of our Bible study at www.abqnaz.org/alive, so that you can follow along with us as we ask questions about the text that we're studying here. So number one says, what happened in our last 2 weeks Bible study? A, Saul made everybody take an oath not to eat until he had avenged himself on his enemies. That's true. B, Jonathan ate. That's true. C, the men were acting rashly and butchering animals and eating them blood and all. That's true. D, God wouldn't answer Saul, and he looked for the one who sinned against God. That's true. And E, the men stepped in to save Jonathan from death. All of those happened in the last 2 weeks. Remember, we took 2 weeks in chapter 14 and covered all of that. So number two says, what is happening in chapter 15, 1 through 6? So in 1 through 6, it says, Um, God told Saul to go and attack the Amalekites and totally destroy all that belongs to them. And this was punishment. Um, and I'm going to go ahead and move down into the second part of the question so that I don't get ahead of myself here. But he told him to go completely destroy. So number 2 says, what was God's specific instruction in verse 3? Now go attack the Amalekites and totally destroy all that belongs to them. Do not spare them. Put to death men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys. So it's very specific instruction. It wasn't just go defeat them. It was go totally destroy them and destroy everything that belongs to them. The third part, why is God punishing the Amalekites according to verse 2? See also Exodus 17. And I'm going to pull up Exodus 17 here. I think one of the things that happens when we're studying a text like this is we kind of struggle with the idea that God would call Israel to destroy everything, to kill everything, men, women, and children, animals. And so whenever God gives an instruction like this, my experience is that we always have questions about how a supposedly loving God could do this and why he would go this far. And so we need to understand, I think, why he did this, because this isn't something that he did all the time, but it is something that he did occasionally, and there always appears to be a reason for it. So in chapter 15, verse 2, it says, this is what the Lord Almighty says, I will punish the Amalekites for what they did to Israel when they waylaid them as they came up from Egypt. So the Israelites were escaping Egypt and coming to the promised land. And the Amalekites took advantage of their weakness and came out to attack them. Now in Exodus chapter 17, we have the story of when that happened. Excuse me. So in chapter 17, verse 8, it says, the Amalekites came and attacked the Israelites at Rephidim. Moses said to Joshua, choose some of your men and go out and fight the Amalekites. Tomorrow I will stand on top of the hill with the staff of God in my hands. So this is we remember the story for the battle and Moses with the staff, but we often don't remember what had happened. In the beginning of chapter 17, it says the whole Israelite community set out from the desert of Sin, traveling from place to place as the Lord commanded. They camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink, so they quarreled with Moses and said, give us water. So they were out there traveling from place to place and they didn't have water. And then the Amalekites saw them and took advantage of the situation and tried to and attack them. But in this case, as long as Moses held up his hands, the Israelites were winning. But whenever he lowered his hands, the Amalekites were winning. When Moses' hand grew tired, they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it. Aaron and Hur held up his hand, one on one side, one on the other, so that his hands remained steady till sunset. So Joshua overcame the Amalekite army with the sword. Verse 14, then the Lord said to Moses, write on a scroll as something to be remembered and make sure that Joshua hears it, because I will completely blot out the name of Amalek from under heaven. So this was a commitment that God made, a promise that God made to Israel while they were while they were homeless, basically, when this army, this nation, did not respect them or take pity on them, or but rather came out to attack them in their weakness. And God did not take kindly to that. And God made a commitment that the Amalekites would be completely destroyed. Now, in our text in First Samuel, God is now following through with his commitment, and he tells Saul what to do. But Saul apparently um, didn't understand the assignment. Um, Number 3 says, how does Saul handle the Kenites according to verse 6? So in verse 6, he said to the Kenites, go away, leave the Amalekites, so that I do not destroy you along with them, for you showed kindness to all the Israelites when they came out of Egypt. So the Kenites moved away from the Amalekites. So basically we have, neighbors fighting together. And maybe not understanding the background and what God's purpose was. And so Saul speaks to the Kenites and says, here's the deal. God has pronounced judgment here. And God has pronounced judgment against the Amalekites, but he's not pronounced good judgment against you. In fact, you guys were kind to the Israelites when we were without a place and we were traveling. And so you don't need to die with them. You don't need to be a part. But if you stand there with them, if you stand with somebody who is ungodly, if you stand with somebody who had no mercy, then you're going to receive the same fate as them. And so Saul just warned the Kenites. They had their choice. And the second part of this says, what might we take away from this interaction and apply to our own lives? I would say this, that too often we as Christians perhaps are not we're not the ones that God is right now visiting his judgment upon. But if we find ourselves standing with those who do evil, then we are going to be in a difficult situation, because we are grouping ourselves with those who God is visiting his judgment upon. And I would just say this, that we need to be real careful in our personal lives. We know that God has told us not to be unequally yoked. And when we have, I'm not just talking about marriage here, but I'm talking about in our business relationships. If we're faithful to God, but we're in business with people who are evil, then what if God visits punishment upon those others and we are standing with them? Okay. And so we just need to be careful about that. I would say, I'm going to be careful here, but I would say in recent days, Christians have tied themselves to politicians who are clearly ungodly, because they've learned, those politicians have learned to fight for causes that we believe in. And we've found ourselves supporting people that are doing things that we can't stomach ourselves, because of whatever Supreme Court justices that they put in or something like that. And I do think we need to be careful tying ourselves to the ungodly. And I know these are confusing times, and we all have voted our conscience in many ways over the years, and that's what we should do. But sometimes we find out that we may have been wrong in that, and sometimes we double down and tie ourselves closer to that, and in doing so have a tendency to um, put ourselves in league with somebody that I fear God may not be pleased with. So that's just a thought about how we could apply this. We just need to be careful, because I don't know that there are any godly politicians, not very many anyway, that I can see. So I know that it's sometimes a difficult choice, but I would say we need to be careful in our associations, in who we support and who we stand with in our lives. And that could be our friends, yeah, the teenagers in particular, I'm thinking of. Stand closely with friends who don't love God and have different purposes, and we could find ourselves in trouble. Number 4, what did Saul do when he defeated the Amalekites? According to verses 8 and 9, it says, he took Agag, king of the Amalekites, alive, and all his people he totally destroyed with the sword. But Saul and the army spared Agag and the best of the sheep and cattle and fat calves and the lambs. Everything was good that was good. These they were unwilling to destroy completely. So the second part says, did this fulfill God's instruction? Yes, no, explain. Well, Saul thought it did. He said, no, I follow God's instruction. But God's instruction, as we read earlier, were very specific, and he very specifically did something other than that. So he did not destroy everything. He kept the best alive. And it says, it doesn't say, I love the way it phrases this. It doesn't say, these he had a different plan for. It says these he was unwilling to destroy. They were unwilling. And I think about that because I think about the things that God might call us to sacrifice in our lives, whether it's the giving of our tithes and offerings, or the giving of our time, or even sacrificing certain things that we enjoy in our schedule, or things like that, for service, for things that God has called us to do for him. And we might be willing to sacrifice certain things. Yeah, the despised, the weak, we can, nobody's going to miss that. But when he asks us to sacrifice the best things, when he asks us to give of the things that really matter to us, I wonder how often it isn't the situation that this could be said of us. Those he was unwilling to sacrifice, those they were unwilling to completely destroy. And so the unwillingness, we tend to logic this out and not use those extreme terms. But when God described this, it says those they were unwilling to destroy. We know God knows what's in our hearts, and he knows the true reason that Saul and his army would not destroy everything and held some things alive the best. Number 5 says, what did God say to Samuel in verses 10 and 11? It says, then the word of the Lord came to Samuel, I regret that I made Saul king, because he turned away from me and has not carried out my instructions. He said he regretted that he made Saul king because Saul couldn't follow his instructions. And the second part, how according to verse 11 did Samuel respond to this word of the Lord? It says Samuel was angry and he cried out to the Lord all night. Surely he was angry at Saul. Perhaps he was hurt that God was saying this thing about somebody who'd probably become close to Samuel. And it says this affected Samuel deeply. I want to say that Samuel as what I would call a pastor, um, was broken by this thing that God said about somebody that he was pastoring. Um, and I think this is the normal response. I think a lot of people in the church might assume that pastors, when they say hard things and when they say the word of the Lord to people and it's judgment, that we're we enjoy it, or that we're so on God's side that we're the enemy of the person that is being judged, perhaps. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about the role of the man of God or woman of God, the person of God, delivering God's message. The assumption is that we're the jerks, and we just like to say mean things to people. But in this case, God said this to Samuel, and Samuel was angry and he cried out to the Lord all night. And so he wasn't happy about this. He was brokenhearted about this. He was hurt by this. And if you look through scripture about people, including Moses, our church is studying the book of Exodus, and we'll see Moses in this pastoral role. You'll find that people hear the word of God and deliver it to God's people, and we often are brokenhearted by what we hear and then have to pass on. So number 6, what do we learn about what Saul was doing afterward, according to verse 12? So verse 12 says, early in the morning, Samuel got up and went to meet Saul, but he was told, Saul has gone to Carmel, where he has set up a monument in his own honor and has turned and gone down to Gilgal. So he's setting up a monument in his own honor. So that's different. That prompts Samuel to say something to Saul about what's really going on underneath this decision. So Saul is justifying what he's doing, but there's really something deeper going on with Saul that we see. These two things are connected. The fact that Saul went up to set up a monument in his own honor it is not disconnected from what he just did. The fact that he chose to do what he wanted instead of what God called him to do was directly tied to the fact that he had decided that, I mean, it's an arrogant thing for God to tell you to do one thing and you to decide to do something else. And so that is the moment when you decide that you know better than God. And so it should not be a surprise that right afterwards, Saul is setting up a monument in his own honor, because we know that Saul has decided that he knows better than God. And so this is the connection is obvious here. The second part says, how did Saul greet Samuel? In verse 13, he says, when Samuel reached him, Saul said, the Lord bless you. I have carried out the Lord's instructions. So I think it's really interesting because when Saul greets Samuel, he sounds more spiritual than he ever has. So he's more arrogant, less obedient, but he knows the spiritual words. So Samuel shows up and he says, the Lord bless you. I have carried out God's instructions. And I find this to be true, that many people know the words to say to sound spiritual, but they have no intention of doing the will of God. And that's where Saul was at here. In fact, his own arrogance made him speak because he thought he was spiritual. He thought he actually proclaimed that he had done what God said, because he did what he wanted to do, and that wasn't what God said, but it was, he had found a way to justify it. And so I find these correlated a lot between people that are really just doing something exactly the opposite of what God calls us to do, and yet have learned to proclaim it in a spiritual way based on their justification, and are therefore sounding more spiritual than ever, even though they are less spiritual than ever and less obedient and in relationship with God than ever. Third part says, what does Samuel say to Saul in verse 14? Samuel points out the obvious discrepancy between Saul's statement and God's instruction. He says, what then is the bleating of sheep in my ears? What is this lowing of cattle that I hear? So if you did everything that God told you, then I wouldn't be hearing these things. But since I'm hearing these things, I know that you haven't done everything that God told you. In verse 15, how did Saul respond? In verse 15, Saul answered, the soldiers brought them from the Amalekites. They spared the best of the sheep and cattle to sacrifice to the Lord your God, but we totally destroyed the rest. So now he's justifying, oh yeah, we didn't destroy it because we're going to use this as sacrifice. God didn't ask for this sacrifice. God told him to destroy them. And so now he's um, justified this. I kind of equate this a little bit to the people that are buying lottery tickets, and they say, you know, if I win, I'll tithe. And well, that's so generous of you. By the way, this church that I pastor is a Church of the Nazarene. We stand against gambling and lotteries, and some people might criticize us for such a supposedly legalistic stance. But we stand against them, one, because they're poor stewardship. Because in fact, it's generally even worse than that. It's poor stewardship. If you are well off financially, it's poor stewardship. But the truth is, statistically, very few rich people buy lottery tickets. Almost everybody that buys lottery tickets are in poverty, because they're grasping at some faint hope of having something more. And so it really becomes a tax on the poor, which is ironic, because with our modern understandings of taxes that tend to be a redistribution of wealth, where we want to tax the rich more and more in order to give out the money to programs for the poor. The lottery is actually the opposite of that. The lottery taxes the poor. And so ironically, the same people that tax the rich to give things to the poor are usually the same ones that heavily support um, lotteries, which tax the poor. But anybody who can do math well knows that you're not going to get rich playing the lottery. That the odds are not in your favor. But people say, well, if I win the lot, I'm going to do this because if I win it, I'll give 10% to the church. And they've justified that in their mind. But they're keeping 90% for themselves. This is not a selfless act. You're not doing this for somebody else. You're keeping something for yourself. You're doing this for yourself and trying to justify it by what you're going to do out of it. That's some small piece of it. But you really want this for yourself. And so a lot of us sort of have justified this as um, being selfless, even though it's selfish. And that's exactly what Saul is doing right here. So Number 7 says, what is Samuel's reaction to Saul's justification and defense in verse 16? He says, enough. Let me tell you what the Lord told me last night. He's not going to hear any of this. Enough. I'm done listening to this. I'm going to tell you what God said, and that's all you need to hear. So Saul says, tell me, and Samuel says, the second part says, what does Samuel say? The problem is in verse 17 and 19. Although you were once small in your own eyes, did you not become the head of the tribes of Israel? The Lord anointed you king over Israel and sent you on a mission, saying, go completely destroy those wicked people, the Amalekites. Wage war against them until you have wiped them out. Why did you not obey the Lord? Why did you pounce on the plunder and do evil in the eyes of the Lord? So he says, I'm not listening to any of the justification. You were once small in your own eyes, but now you've become large. You didn't deserve anything, and God gave you something you didn't deserve, but now all of a sudden you think you know better than God. And by the way, this can happen to Christians, this can happen to pastors, this can happen to anybody, where we begin serving God with humility, recognizing he gave us something that we didn't deserve, and we end up thinking that we know what we're doing, and doing it our way instead of God's way. We need to be awful careful. Number 8, what is Saul's response in verses 20 and 21? It says, but I did obey the Lord. I went on the mission the Lord assigned me. I completely destroyed the Amalekites and brought back Agag, their king. So Saul doesn't seem to be getting it. Completely destroyed seems to be a phrase that he doesn't quite understand, because he says, I completely destroyed the Amalekites, and then in the same sentence, and brought back Agag, their king. Agag, their king, is an Amalekite who he didn't destroy. So he's continuing the justification. And the last question, number 9, says, how do you respond to correction? And so I would say that a lot of us, unfortunately, respond in a very similar way to how Saul responds. We justify ourselves. We are not accepting the correction that God is bringing, but rather saying, no, I did do what you say. I just did this. And we're not receiving that correction and saying, no, you're right. I didn't do it the way God told me. I did something different. And we need to respond to that. We need to change. We need to do the will of God exactly as he says it, not how we've justified ourselves in doing.